Okay, welcome everyone to this paper session on today's Wednesday, the 17th of January, the second session of the day's conference. We have three paper presentations by Helen Jarvis, Cheryl Coulthard, and Shlomo Getz. We have a total of 1.5 hours, so a total of 30 minutes per presenter. Sounds like a good plan. 20 minutes for the paper or the presentation or a talk, and 10 minutes for question and answers. I can warn the presenters when it's 5 minutes left or 2 minutes, and by just saying so, if that's okay. And then when it's time for question and answers, participants can use the raise hand button at the bottom under reactions, and then I'll keep track and call you when it's time to ask your questions. So with this, I hope it is okay by the presenters to introduce themselves and then proceed to the presentations. So I'll first call on Helen. Would you like to start?
Thanks. Yes, I need to present, share my screen. So I'm going to do that. Okay. So, yeah, I'm Helen Jarvis, and I'm a social geographer at Newcastle University in the UK. I have 20 years of experience working with intentional communities, but recently I've become very interested in theories of social change, which I think are very embedded in intentional communities, but also draw from elsewhere and other traditions. So that's kind of where I'm going to come from today. And so just make sure I set my own timer here. I attended ICSA in Denmark, and then before that in Findhorn, and in fact the image on the front of this is from that from a workshop at Findhorn in 2013. So the context for this talk, I suppose, is the sense in which many presenters at this conference have talked about the state of the world. We are facing polycrises, multiple crises. And what is the role of intentional communities in addressing and responding to these crises? So the context is one of maybe rising activism and, change makers. And to some extent, there's a state of protest, but there are limits to protests. So I'm interested in this idea of what happens when we recognize that individual citizens are powerless on their own to change the course of these big crises. And the impetus there is to come together, to gather in new social movements or in solidarity organizations, or indeed in place, in movements of place, as with intentional communities. And I think intentional communities have a lot of lessons to teach protest movements, because as we know, many national protests and transnational protests such as Occupy Wall Street gave rise to, or were claiming that they gave rise to fundamental changes to everything. But critics have said that actually almost always they are bound to fail, because protest alone lacks a theory and a method of resistance and change to the mainstream. And hence there's a whole sort of renewed interest in what constitutes real change and effective collective action, the kind of we connections of being intentional, of living and practicing and inhabiting the change of social transformation. So there is a kind of cruel optimism in many forms of protest that I think intentional communities can address. But I went in my research to look at, so this is kind of the starting point, to look at some of the, so my motivations was for this, came from this renewed interest in the potential for intentional communities to inspire global social change. But are they able to live up to their potential? So I'm very interested in this idea of what is traditionally considered to be the vision and values, the purpose, the intentionality of communities, where they're characterized as countercultural, of attracting pioneers of social and technical innovation. So they are transformative entities. But traditionally, the theory of change that's been associated with intentional communities is change via a diffusion effect, sort of social learning, experimentation, the kind of demonstration effect of alternative worlds are possible because look, you see an alternative world here, we are living it, we are breathing it. But the diffusion model tends to show that the innovators who are inhabiting change are a very tiny proportion of a normal distribution of different social norms, and to actually tip the balance from a niche innovation to a change in regime, to really tackle these multiple crises in the world, there has to be a sense of effective change from the innovation to the mainstream. And is this happening? So there's, throughout history, intentional communities have had this characteristic of challenging countercultural, of challenging the mainstream. But to what extent have they been able to challenge the stereotype of being a very minority early innovators and early adopters, and as shown in this illustration? So how far do intentional communities follow a theory of change? Because you could say that the diffusion model, is it credible as a theory of change? Are intentional communities too niche to challenge structures of inequality, hegemonic power? Can intentional communities organize for change beyond their internal governance and maybe their small scale habitus? As I say, I'm really interested in the real change of effective cultural collective action. So I've been looking at a series of theories of change, which are typically defined as ways of articulating the kind of persuasive causal logic of the actions that we take, a kind of almost, actions that we take which can be collective and can be individual. And certainly it's the collective I'm interested in, because there is the power, people power of, the sum being greater than the parts of the individual. And a theory of change is a holistic theory-based method. We sometimes talk about habits of action, when action, being active and oriented towards effective change, is an everyday habit. It's not something that we have to sort of like step into or superficially adopt. And this way it cultivates a systematic and cumulative cycle of activities, a real learning process, cycle of outcomes, context, and interventions. Is often called if, then, because, why. And I suppose an example of the difference between an action which is not systematically linked to a theory and a method of change and a theory of change would be, if your goal was to eradicate poverty, would you focus on addressing structural inequality, low income, inability to survive and thrive? Or would you focus your attention on providing food banks, providing services, providing, sort of some alleviation of the distress of poverty? So initiatives rarely solve the actual problem. They drive action, they can make you feel better, but they don't bring about effective change. So I'm coming rather late to the idea of the aims of this paper, but the reason I'm putting it here is that the aims today are actually part of an ongoing book project about being intentional, where I'm actually trying to unite two intersecting realms of human environmental connectedness. Intentional communities, which is obviously the audience interest here, but I'm also very involved with community organizing, which is like a broad-based people-powered movement that was born out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Intentional communities and community organizing share many similar attributes, But intentional communities are inhabited, whereas community organizing is people power where you're at. It's kind of action oriented around particular campaigns and initiatives. So what I'm doing today is really, I suppose, putting a call out for the fact that I'm very interested to hear from intentional communities who believe maybe they're doing community organizing in their intentional community, because I haven't seen the uniting of these two separate strands of work brought together in any meaningful way in the literature, but it might be in practice. Because I'm really drawing attention to common threads of intentionalities in groups, group action, groupiness, that imagine and achieve intentional relationships and a theory of change. And all of this is very much focused on this mesoscale and microsociology of less heroic social environmental justice initiatives. Less heroic, I say, because protests are often very heroic, but also very ineffective at change. And I believe that the effective change will be where we're at in our, where people are very invested in people and place. So intentional communities are historically discrete from the direct action of new social movements, but they do share some commonality with community organizing. And by being intentional for people and planet, groups can serve, intentional communities can serve as laboratories of learning and change, which is why I suppose they've always can be considered to be very relevant for global social change. However, critics identify often ideological barriers and interpersonal challenges that prevent intentional communities from fully aligning their unity of purpose and self-governance with a theory or a strategy and methods to resist and change the status quo. And I think that's often because the disconnect between maybe a social movement tends to be issues oriented and outward oriented, and intentional communities have a lot of effort in terms of maintaining their nurturing and maintaining the sense of community and belonging. This is both their strength and their limitation as change makers, because the strength is that a community of solidarity and belonging is much stronger than individuals acting individually. But it takes a lot of effort to hold together that group, and it tends not to be then mobilized or forged in terms of propelling a wider social change. So I think that intentional communities can usefully learn from and adopt place-based theories of change. I've pulled up here some books of how much appetite there is for this idea of change, effective change, a theory of change, of tipping from the early adopters and innovators to regime change. And these are just some very recent books, Hungry for Change, A Handbook for Changing the World, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist. It's Not That Radical, Climate Action to Transform Our World, which is from very young activists in the environmental movement. So just to decipher the acronyms I've used here. So I'm very interested in the tension, the theory of change, discomfort and tension that sits between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And these are terms that are often used in community organizing, in the civil rights movement, in the human rights movement, as a theory of change. So navigating between these points confronts meaningful change as a journey. So it's not about the world as it should be, living and inhabiting in a mythical utopia. It's not about arriving at a place and sitting there and stable, because it's kind of the world as it should be. We're not in the world as it should be. We are sitting at the very far end in a kind of aspirational. The world as it is a place that we need to change. So change is needed, and it needs to be real, not rhetorical, to close the gap in structural inequalities, to speed up and complete the transition away from fossil fuels, net zero, to enshrine human rights and social environmental justice. And very importantly, in this year, when 50% of the world is going to the polls in elections of various presidential and general form, facing a hollowing out of democracy. We need to enshrine human rights that strengthens democracy and prospects for hope and equity everywhere. Everyone wants to make change, whether it's to reduce loneliness, end racism, or save the planet. Yet even when social change is a stated goal, few intentional communities, in my opinion, and I'm very open to being challenged on this and to receive from you or any of the listeners who hear this recorded, to present evidence to the contrary. But I believe that few intentional communities fully align their unity of purpose and self-governance with explicit methods and strategies of organizing to drive change. And that change can be their own change from within, but it's also change beyond the confines of that community, change within wider solidarity movements. So one of the books that I could have put up in the previous slide, it's a very new one, by Deepak Bagara and Stephanie Lucet. They express similar frustration that I mentioned earlier with underperforming new social movements, such as Occupy Wall Street and others, Extinction Rebellion even. The many progressive social movements and forms of protests are insufficiently strategic. And they identify 7 strategies of change making. And I won't go through listing these, I've got about 5 minutes left. But I've listed them here because I think what's interesting is that most of these strategies come from the broad-based community organizing movement of people power, of power in numbers, forming alliances of ordinary citizens, building a base to which they can challenge, speak truth to power and challenge and lobby states and markets and commercial power. But some on this list are also overlap with intentional communities. For example, I visited Nimbin and many of the multiple, the sort of early 1970s intentional communities of the Rainbow region in Australia. And through organizing a collective alliance of communities called the Nimbin Pan Community Alliance, several communitarians or members of communities there specifically sought regional change, regime change by standing up for elections. So they actually stood in local government positions to bring about electoral change. And many intentional communities involve a lot of training and education, and that can be used to sort of build up the scale and depth of building up people power and momentum of change. And there's also, of course, a lot of collective care, mutual aid in communities, which is demonstrated, practiced, educated, and shared with the wider society.
You have 2 minutes, Helen.
Yes, I've got time. Yes, okay, I'm wrapping up now. So yeah, so I haven't had time to sort of elaborate on this, but I'm just putting out there that there might be some potential to change this. And there's also other, yeah, I've got too many slides here. I realize that I ran out of time. But the last 2 slides just show illustrations of how this might be expressed, dimensions of change in and for community. The model of theory of change that I draw on a lot is from a community organising movement in the UK called Citizens UK that aligns habits of action with unity of purpose and has 5 steps of social change. And it's interesting, in my research, I found that some intentional communities using trauma-informed research have also explicitly harnessed a theory of change where they draw on the conditions through strategies to outcomes in that sort of sense of iterative cycle. So just in conclusion, I think intentional communities do have a unique role and place in driving change, but I do think they need to be open to learn from other new social movements in dialogue and in alliance. And I think the key thing is that intentional communities is significant and beneficial to existing theories of change, because the plain fact, to quote David Orr, is that the planet does not need more successful people. It needs people who live well in their places. This is exactly what intentional communities do, who are willing to join the fight to change the world, to make it more habitable and more humane, And these qualities have little to do with success or with success as our culture defines it. That's part of the change. So apologies, I went a little bit over, and I'll stop there and stop the share there.
Thank you very much, Helen. Now I will open the floor for questions, but I also see that Albert Bates has written a short comment in the chat. Would you like to read it or say your comment, Albert, in case he wanted to? I can read it. Albert says, last week we had a deep dive into the theory of change. Okay, let me, okay. Anton, Albert is saying that his mute system is not unlocking.
I'm trying to unmute him. Can you unmute him? Because I can't.
What was that?
Can you unmute him? Click on his name and unmute, because I can't.
Yeah.
You're the host.
Yeah, I tried also to unmute, but it's not allowing me. But I can read that while you look at it, Anton. Yeah, so I'll just read and then we move on to Tony. Last week we had a deep dive into the theory of change regarding the climate crisis in our regular climate chat. You can see the session, and he has shared the link. We discuss protest, organizing, and other strategies in terms of what works and why. So it's a pity that he can elaborate more, but his comment. But Tony, I see you. Would you like to share your comment?
No, it was only just that one of the people that I do some work with had been working on this idea called mosaic transformation, and it's a way of looking at systemic change. And it's Patrick Hoverstadt, and there's a paper on it which you're welcome to go and explore, because it looks at why change often fails, because people don't deal with the impact at the boundaries of the change. And so this is a really useful way of exploring how to deal with the boundaries but basically what people read as being resistance, but effectively is lack of attention to the boundaries of a change, and therefore where tension and friction then occurs between the change that they're trying to drive and what's happening around it. The other place, I don't know whether you come across Donella Meadows, the places to intervene in a system. That's a really, really good approach to looking at how to deal with the issues of change. And one of the findings of it is really that governments, in particular, the UK is not unusual in this, tries to make change happen by imposing targets, which, as Donella says, is the least effective way of driving change. And she talks about the most effective ways being changing paradigms.
Yeah, I mean,
how to go about that.
I'm familiar with that work, and obviously there's a lot of theoretical work about theories of change. I think the reason why I'm very interested to bring it to intentional community is because of the very practical nature of inhabiting, living, being and doing the change, rather than having theorizing it from afar. And I suppose I'm drawing particularly from the community organizing work that I get involved with, which is Saul Alinsky inspired, because I think it's very, very conscious that I mean, if we're going to experience a paradigm shift, for instance, to more sustainable degrowth or to transitions to, more sustainable and socially just ways of living, that they have to be democracy from below, and that's very people-based. So yes, there's a lot of sort of understanding about paradigm shifts and these big sort of things, but actually the change that I've witnessed has been very much don't bite off more than you can chew. Make sure that the small changes are actually credible and tangible. And so I've been very involved with ones where, it's the small change that's then part of some bigger understanding of listening and acting on the will of the alliance, the will of the people building power. But I won't say more, but that's very useful. I'll copy all those things from the thing. I'm always very willing to listen to those. I think, but I'm very tapped into the practical side that intentional communities are to some extent experimenting every day. So they're very good living laboratories to go to kind of explore some of these issues.
I think you might find the mosaic change interesting then, because that does deal with a lot of these. The mosaic can be small or large pieces, which is an interesting way of looking at it.
It's just that, I mean, so the community organising work with it, we've had some very real wins, and that's what you want to look at. You want to look at case study of actual success stories, and they are, you know, these are concrete neighbourhood wins.
Yes, we have 5 more minutes. Anyone that would like to share a comment, a thought, or ask a question?
Yeah.
I've got.
Oh, okay.
Go for it.
Who? Should
Yeah.
I or should the other person? I don't know.
You go first, and then
Okay.
Anton second.
I want to bring people's attention. I will also talk about this during my presentation, about another paradigm for change, which is based on multi-level selection theory, which is a branch of evolutionary theory, and also on emergence theory. So this is the next step beyond Donella Meadows and the early systems theorists. And you could start by asking, why is life composed of cells, organs, multicellular organisms, colonies of insects, families of people, and intentional communities, and so on? Why do we not just have a soup of organic molecules? And one of the answers is because in order to do anything, you need a membrane, not a wall, but a membrane that allows you to focus energy and information inside the membrane. And my claim is that capitalism, global capitalism right now, is dissolving all membranes, such as intentional communities, villages, tribes, even nation states, and now with the attention economy, even integrated in the Jungian sense, individuals. And so you're not going to be able to do any significant change as long as global capitalism is something that you're not aware of and inoculated against in ways that I will discuss. Your community boundary will be dissolved by global capitalism, and you will not be able to do anything unless you do certain things to avoid that. I'm open to discussion and hope that people can come to my presentation about this.
It's good you make connections to other sessions. I think that's really good for this conference, is to have a bigger conversation.
I wanted to comment, Helen, that I live in an intentional community that's involved in community organising. And I think on the one hand, you talk about communities living the change that they want to be, they want to see. And I'm convinced that that's not enough. You need to be proactive externally and not just living the good life internally. And I think there's a tension there between the community organising that you do in your surroundings and the internal hard labour that it takes to maintain and for the community itself to exist and function. And so there's always that tension between how much energy you put into the community itself and how much tension and how much energy you put into building those partnerships externally in the neighborhood, in the surrounding society. Wondering your thoughts on that tension, because you sort of didn't mention that sort of tension, and I wanted to know what you thought about that.
Yeah, and actually, Anton, I'd love to speak with you separately, to get more ideas about your community experience of this, because I think those are the kind of testimonies I'm really interested in getting from my research. I didn't mention it, but I have actually been very influenced, and I have talked about it previously, that I think intentional communities do experience a kind of, sometimes quite a lot of why certainly I've been involved with forming intentional communities that have failed, because the tension between the task function of a project, building community, getting off the ground, organizing working groups, but also you could say the task of maybe community organizing for external campaigns in the neighborhood and elsewhere is in tension with the maintenance function of group coherence. And I suppose, as I mentioned at the beginning, that I did feel that the very strength of intentional communities, that meso scale of kind of belonging and being a kind of self-contained organism, is also its limitation, because to keep that going involves so much effort that it can actually mean that you're doing the work on holding together and not the work of actually growing or starting communities elsewhere or being activists and changing the world. So there really is a tension now, but I'd love to, I can't say more now because I think we've run out of time, but I'd love to speak with you more about your particular community, because I think I'd love to hear more about communities like kibbutz that do community organizing alongside and in tension with their day-to-day work.
Perfect. That was a nice wrap up of the first session. The next presenter is Cheryl Coulthard. Would you like to introduce yourself and your topic?
Sure. Good morning. Well, hello, everybody. I won't say good morning because I know you're all in different time zones. My name is Cheryl Coulthard, and I'm a historian. I work on 19th and 20th century communities in the United States, particularly on women in community and on religious and spiritual communities. And I guess I should mention I have a book out in the Cambridge Element series this month, and it's called Communal Societies and New Religious Movements. So my presentation this morning is about the Kerista community. So we're switching here from the theoretical to the historical. And it's actually a community that fits well with what Helen was talking about, in that they were working very hard on creating a better life for themselves within their community, but they also did a tremendous amount of community outreach to questionable effect. So the Kerista community existed in San Francisco during the 1970s and 80s. It was a small but thriving urban community that challenged traditional ideas about marriage, sexuality, child rearing, and balancing capitalism with shared labor and property. Although it was very successful economically, it eventually imploded over conflicts about the value of labor, shared responsibilities, and the way they manage conflict. So this morning, I'm going to talk about and explore their Gestaltorama system, which was their system for managing conflict in community, and the disagreements that led to their breakup, and the structure of power within this supposedly egalitarian community. Kerista was an intentional community formed in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. That's kind of the hippie central in the 1960s and 70s. By Judd Pressmont in 1971, and it endured in this manifestation until 1989. Pressmont created other incarnations of Kerista both before and after the San Francisco version, but none of them enjoyed the financial and community success of the San Francisco commune. So this presentation will focus on the Haight-Ashbury Kerista. This community developed its own vocabulary to define and explain its religion, its practices, its organization, and goals. These terms will be introduced and defined where appropriate throughout this presentation. Kerista grew out of the Haight-Ashbury scene of the late 1960s in San Francisco, and also the beatnik Bohemian enclaves in New York City. Judd Pressmont and Eve Furchgott, also known as Eve and Eve, co-founded it in 1971 upon ideals of economic communalism, democracy, and equality, using structures such as polyfidelity and mutual criticism to achieve these goals. Judd created strict and extensive rules about living in Kerista because the New York Kerista had been anarchist and struggled because of the lack of structure. Judd concluded that to live in harmony, people need rules. Now, it could be argued that Judd went too far here. He insisted that the members of the community adhere to initially 26 rules, then 76 rules by 1983, and eventually that number went up to 88 rules. And some of these rules were common sense, like number 18, clean up your own mess. And number 19, nonviolence except in circumstance of self-defense. While others, such as number 2, orthodox polyfidelity, number 3, multiple parenting of children, and number 4, transitional celibacy, proved much more intrusive and harder to follow. Polyfidelity was the Keristans' term for their polyamorous relationships within their cluster groups in the commune. The rules also laid out the structure of the community, including its shared economy, majority rule on all decisions, and participation in the Gestaltorama. So I'll talk a bit about what Gestaltorama was. The Keristans instituted the Gestaltorama process as an egalitarian democratic process for settling disputes, airing grievances, and encouraging personal responsibility. This system echoed the mutual criticism practice used in the 19th century at the Oneida community, and also in the Marxist-influenced communities and organizations of the 1960s and 70s. The term shows the influence of Gestalt theories of psychological therapy popular at the time, originating with Fritz Perls' 1951 book, Gestalt Therapy. Perls' school of thought emphasized, quote, 1, that the most helpful focus of psychotherapy is the experiential present moment, and that everyone is caught in webs of relationships. And 2, thus it is only possible to know ourselves against the background of our relations with others, end quote. So these ideas combined with the theory behind mutual criticism, that is that, quote, a member of the community would volunteer to put themselves forward in order to be honestly evaluated by all other members of the society so as to better one's character, end quote, pretty well explain Kerista's purpose and practice. The Kerista Village Handbook lists the rules for Gestaltorama. And these, of course, again, are extensive and often unrealistic and intrusive. Total voluntary accountability of personal thoughts, feelings, behavior, activities, and finances. High verbality level, meaning use your words. Total honesty and Gestalt interaction. Desire for truthful knowledge. No duplicity. The ability to say no. Good manners and sensitivity. No getting angry. No tantrums. No obnoxious behavior. Acceptance of growth and change, and a positive view of human nature as expressed in utopian psychology. Keristans defined utopian psychology as using experiential learning to create better relationships and better people with the ultimate goal of a better world. They believed that the best approach to creating a utopian society, both small and large scale, was to use Gestaltorama to develop stronger relationships and for self-improvement. The idea was that having the people closest to you force you to confront your faults and failures would allow you to reflect and improve yourself. And of course, not everybody finds public confrontations comfortable. And most people don't like being called out in front of others. So while good manners, acceptance, and honesty seem like reasonable guidelines for discussing and resolving grievances, it seems unreasonable to expect that no one would get angry. When you dig a little deeper into the steps and techniques for Gestaltorama, it becomes clear that while the idea of the process may have been sound, the practice was significantly flawed. One simple example, while good manners and sensitivity were expected behaviors, so was yelling out ding-a-ling when a member used repeated verbal fillers such as, you know, like, and Think for a moment about someone being called out publicly, first of all, for a behavior that's causing stress in the community. And then when you try to respond, having been interrupted every time you say, I think in such a situation that I would quickly become defensive and frustrated, which of course was also not allowed. Other practices that sabotage the success of Gestaltorama include caricaturing, that is, mimicking someone's bad behavior in an exaggerated way. Putting in the drain, that is, demanding what else every time a person makes an excuse. And stacking or laying the criticisms against a member pile up before they were allowed to respond. Factor in the jealousies of a controlled polyamorous system and the challenges of a much older authoritarian leader. And it's not hard to see how these sessions, which could go on for hours, could become heated and emotional. The Keristans used this process to resolve quotidian matters like frustration that some members weren't cleaning up after themselves, but it was also a place to air much more personal concerns. The Keristans were polyamorous, but in a very structured way. So they had subgroups of 8 people that each shared partners on an equal basis. And the idea of this was to break down intimate bonds and jealousy so that members committed to Kerista rather than a partner. They enforced this by using a chore wheel to rotate partners and even bedrooms on a daily basis. Everyone within a subgroup was supposed to have the same level of intimacy with each partner, and it was unacceptable to refuse a partner. Founding member Eve notes that, quote, in reality, it was often not that way. Many of us did find ourselves at different times in bed with people that on our own, there was no way on earth we would have ended up with. The way it sometimes worked was that a few influential members of a group would be interested in a new person, and they would gestalt, that is, harangue others who didn't share that feeling until they assented to accept the new person, end quote. While every person of the subgroup voted on whether to accept new members as a means of trying to avoid conflicts of this type, in reality, people gravitate towards individuals unequally. It's difficult to predict, particularly over time and when living communally, who one will be attracted to and enjoy spending intimate time with. This became more evident as the community continued into its second decade. Especially, this became an issue with Judd, a generation older than the other members to begin with, as he became physically less attractive to the young women who were surrounded by men their own age. The do-it-yourself mental health techniques of the Gestaltorama process lists 139 steps and rules to set up sessions or work on self-improvement. The Keristans used it regularly themselves and taught the process to others. Basically, the participants gathered together and one person at a time would air their grievances. Others could add on if they had
5 minutes, Cheryl.
Thank you. Sorry, did you say 5?
Yeah, approximately.
Okay. Basically, the participants gathered together and one person at a time would air their grievances. Others could add on if they had additional information or examples to supplement the original concern. After everyone had their say, if an individual was identified in relation to the grievance, they would have an opportunity to respond. However, if they were defensive, angry, dishonest, etc., they could expect to be called out for it. The goal was to air grievances on a regular basis while they were still minor and deal with them before they became major conflicts. However, the reality of the sessions, particularly later on, is that they became opportunities for Judd to focus attention on women that he felt didn't give him enough attention, or men of whom he was jealous. Despite its egalitarian and democratic ideals, Judd often acted in an authoritarian way and imposed his will on the other Keristans. In retrospect, several members expressed regrets that they allowed themselves to be drawn into Judd's petty problems and that they piled on the criticisms when they weren't really fair or warranted. They called this, quote, rejecting an analysis. Not responding was seen as an admission of guilt. In the audio recordings of the sessions, you can hear Judd's anger and defensiveness. Publicly, the Keristans gave the impression that polyfidelity worked for them and that they were living up to their ideals. Member Blue Jay Way in 1979 in Communities magazine countered the perception that Judd was their leader by stating, quote, his forceful personality combined with most people's unconscious desires to be led caused some people in the community to expect him to take more of an active role in the affairs of the community than they themselves were interested in taking, end quote. So according to Way, it wasn't that Judd was trying to control Kerista. The issue was that some members wanted to be sheep and Judd took up the slack. While Way is clearly giving the official Kerista line and responding to concerns that were often raised about Kerista, the fact that she felt the need to do so indicates that outsiders saw Judd as problematic. Interestingly, women in Kerista held significant power. They controlled the businesses and were the public face of Kerista. They translated Judd's ramblings into Kerista's publications or recruitment materials. It was also women who ultimately led the revolt against Judd. However, by the time Kerista broke up, founding member Eve explains, quote, Judd's schemes grew more unrealistic and more grandiose, and his personality became increasingly aggressive and difficult to deal with, end quote. Utopian scholar Lyman Tower Sargent visited Kerista with some colleagues and attended a Gestaltorama session. He recalls that Judd harangued him about being uptight because he questioned some of Kerista's practices. His experience was not uncommon. Member Tip Tai responds in a Kerista article about the process. Quote, we have often encountered people who think we should treat people we are getting to know within our process differently according to how long we have known them, because we have not yet built up a trust base. They claim Gestaltorama is too intense or harsh, or that we are manipulative, and they get angry. They feel it's wrong to make value judgments and limiting to have strong opinions and defined beliefs. This is very contradictory and hypocritical because these feelings are in themselves judgments and beliefs. I am convinced that the real issues they are dealing with are fear, inertia, and pure defensiveness. They are afraid they will have to face the contradictions in their lives. They lack the drive and motivation to do the intense work involved in growth. In this process, they would sometimes have to acknowledge that they are wrong about something, which might be the toughest thing of all, end quote. Even Eve also noted that despite the democratic and egalitarian ideals, quote, every ex-Keristan I have talked with remembers numerous instances of going along with the prevailing group sentiment on an issue rather than take a contrary stand. Or worse still, without even bothering to really think the issue through independently. Judd's forceful style of conversation and confrontation became the model for how Keristans related to each other and outsiders. Only the most courageous Keristans dared to openly disagree with Judd, end quote. As the community shifted from subsistence living to increased wealth due to its abacus computer business, tensions increased over the practice of economic sharing. The members who were spending longer hours working and taking on additional responsibility felt less satisfied with the arrangement. They felt they should have more say in the community's budget than members, including Judd, who contributed less. Abacus created other issues by bringing members into the outside world, where they were exposed to different ideas and practices and had their own beliefs challenged. Over time, the frustrations of particularly the young women heavily involved in Abacus led to a major confrontation with Judd. Quote, what kicked off the breakoff of the Kerista commune was really pretty straightforward. Bottom line, some of us decided it was time to make Judd answerable to the same standards everybody else was expected to live by and play as an equal. Given that demand, he decided to leave, end quote. Soon after Judd left, the community dissolved altogether. While Judd was deeply problematic as a community leader, he was in many ways the glue that held them together. Eve observed that the members found that they didn't have as much in common as they thought, and they drifted apart. Some members continued to live communally and or polyamorously, but they all sought an arrangement where they felt their voices were heard and they had more positive and equal social, emotional relationships.
2 minutes now.
In studying communes, both past and present, I have observed that most communities start out with strongly stated ideals and high levels of commitment, but over time, particularly as they shift generationally and or demographically, the commitment often slides and members begin to acknowledge a gap between their rhetoric and the reality of their lives. Religious communities find that their members' level of commitment shifts in response to outside pressures and societal changes. Groups that began with an authoritarian leader find that they need to reconsider, or they need to consider a succession plan and to address the differences in how first and later generations respond to this type of leadership structure. Often without some type of revival movement, later generations reject the organization, ideals, and leaders that appealed so much to their parents. Communities that adapt to changes, both external and internal, are able to survive and thrive better than those that resist change. Kerista is a prime example within just one generation of this rhetoric-reality gap, the challenges of an aging authoritarian leader, and the failure to adapt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, it was very interesting to hear about Kerista community. I will now open up the floor for questions, comments, reflections after this presentation.
Oh, one thing I should mention that has nothing to do with this is I'm also the book review editor for Communal Society's journal. So if you hear about any books, podcasts, movies, anything related to communal societies, please send me an email, or if you're interested in being a reviewer.
Yes, Tony
I
has
have a question.
Oh yeah, please.
So Cheryl, if you could change a few things about Kerista in order to have it survive and thrive, would you be able to do that, or is it just hopelessly defective?
I think that if they had wanted to survive, they needed to adapt and recognize that Judd is an authoritarian leader, and particularly because he was 20 plus years older than the rest of the members, wasn't representing the needs of the people in the community, and he wasn't responding as an equal and within their ideals. So I think the adaptation had to come about in that Judd had to recognize that the way he was behaving was inappropriate, and that they needed to come up with a system that more accurately reflected their ideals. I think if they had done that, they would have been they would have continued much longer. Their business structure, actually, they had a multi-million-dollar computer resale business in the 1980s. So they were remarkably successful economically, which many communities, particularly of that type, were not. So that was not a factor for them, but they needed to deal with their decision-making process and reevaluate their leadership.
There's a question in the chat: to what extent are ICs cognizant of the impact of emergent properties of the community, especially where these may not align to original espoused values?
Yeah, the question kind of comes from my thinking and reading of Jane Jacobs' stuff around systems of survival, where she looks at systems, guardianship and entrepreneurship in human social communities. And it's this idea that, obviously communities drift and things emerge and new properties come out of how the humans interact within the social system. So I'm kind of interested, particularly from your example of, were there emergent properties that were recognized, or even did the community have a way of recognizing things that were emerging and dealing with them, or did it just like lock back to, oh no, this is what we said in the first place, so therefore it can't move?
So thank you for that question. And Albert, I know, can comment further on this, because the farm is actually a great example of a community that had a charismatic leader and had a system that was not always working for everybody, either in terms of economic sharing or in terms of leadership and the influence of the leader over otherwise democratic systems. And they adapted and were able to continue. Another example would be the Hutterites. The Hutterites, of course, have been around for a very long time, and they are continually adapting to things like the internet or the impact that evangelical communities have had upon their community and their young people. And they're in a continually evolving state in terms of how to deal with these changes, both outside the community and what's going on within the community, and how to make it continue to work, particularly for their young people, and dealing with differing amounts of commitment religiously into their practices between older members and younger members in the community. So I think communities absolutely can adapt and change successfully. Amana is another example of a community that went through a major reorganization and continues to this day in a different form than the way it did originally. So I think it's possible, but members of the community have to make the commitment to adapting and figuring out what ideals are most important to them and how to make those continue and live up to those ideals.
Mitchell Jones has also a question or a comment. He has raised his hand.
Hey, Mitch. Where'd he go?
You're muted. We can't hear you. His video just moved.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Hi, Cheryl, and congrats on the book. I wanted to say
Oh,
too.
thanks.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Gestaltorama, because I just watched actually a really good. I was really kind of surprised at how sympathetic and well done it was. With I think it was Netflix or something like that, documentary on Synanon. I think it's called My Life in Synanon or Child of Synanon, something like that. But it's the Gestaltorama sounds pretty similar to the game.
Yeah.
In Synanon. And I know that there were a lot of groups, there was like Esalen and Est, and there were a lot of these groups doing this like Gestalt therapy thing. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of origins of that, and why did Judd think he needed to, include this therapeutic concept in the community?
So it's very much a product of its time. As you mentioned, Synanon, Esalen, the EST. There was a whole lot of in the 70s, psychological emphasis and theories about self-improvement. That's really what those communities were about. So it's very much coming out of that atmosphere. And Judd was very much a student of communal society. So he read about Oneida and other 19th century communities and was familiar with them and the systems that they use. So it's coming out of both that research and the environment at the time. And his thinking was that it would help with dealing with conflict in the community in a constructive way. It would help with self-improvement. And then this idea that of being the change you want to see in the world. So if you want the world to be a better place and there to be stronger relationships between and more interconnectivity between people, you start by improving yourself and your relationships with the people closest to you. And Judd very much had this, I think of it as the kind of Bond villain plan for taking over the world. It reminds me a lot of Fourier too, is that his idea was you start small and then you gradually expand it until this communal system takes over the world. So it was very much of start with self-improvement. That was the goal behind it. But if you listen to the audio recordings, which Hamilton College has a whole archive of them, it was pretty clear that it was not the positive, constructive system that it sounds like on paper.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the game too.
Yeah.
Yes, we have two more questions and we have 2 minutes. So if you can make your questions brief, and then we will move to the next presenter. All right, Hasmukh, you are first.
Can I? Yeah.
Yeah.
So my question, you alluded to polyamory in the community, and
Right.
the way it came out as was like a forced polyamory. And I'm just asking the question, if that was not there, because intimacy is private and personal, if that was taken out of the equation, would that community have survived longer?
So forced, I guess, it was forced in the sense that you were assigned a partner each night, a different partner each night. But everybody that was in the community chose to be polyamorous and part of that group. So I don't think that the polyamory in itself was the problem. I think the way that they related with each other and the lack of equality in this and democracy in this supposedly egalitarian community was the bigger problem. I don't think it was polyamory itself.
Okay. Albert, would you like to pose your question?
Cheryl mentioned the farm, and I think we came out of much of the same history and background of Kerista. I visited Kerista a number of times, attended their first Gestalterama sessions. They were very similar to the kind of encounter group sessions we did in the early days of the farm, what I call the boot camp phase of the farm. And the farm always considered itself a school of change. For us to go through the changes that we had to go to survive was kind of like becoming the shav. And we went ahead and did that. And I think that was our story of success. Here's a historical point you may find interesting. One time, Stephen Gaskin was out in San Francisco, and I was there at the same time. And so I invited him to come to a Gestalterama with Bro Judd. And he had had some earlier experiences in the late 60s with Bro Judd, wasn't really a fan. But we went, and we sat through the Gestalterama, and Judd held forth and dominated the room. And afterwards, I asked Stephen why he had been so quiet. And he said, well, it was Judd's show. And really, that was it. It was Judd's method of kind of holding control of the group, was using a so-called egalitarian session, but really it was underpinning, reinforcing Judd's authoritarian nature. And I think Stephen immediately saw that one to participate.
I think it would have been fascinating to see Gaskin and Judd in the same room together.
Should we wrap up with that and then let Shlomo start? And then if we have a few minutes left, then we will wrap up for all the three. But please, Shlomo, would you like to short introduction about yourself and on to your presentation?
Okay. I'm Shlomo Getz. I'm the head of the Institute for the Research of the Kibbutz and the Cooperative Idea at the University of Haifa in Israel. I'm a kibbutz member in the northern part of Israel. The presentation is based on a paper wrote with Professor Chezi Dar from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and is about challenges in management of commune, about internal problems of communes. And so let's go. Communes are multifunctional organizations, collectively maintaining housing, economic production, consumption, services, children education, social and cultural activities. The commune uphold the life of sharing and equality in a comprehensive social system in the ecology of a discrete settlement. The traditional kibbutz is an example of collective intentional community or commune. In most recognized organizations, management devolves on quite a restricted part of the life of people involved. Usually it's a position in the organization, mostly a professional position. Being parents, citizens, consumer, actor in other organizations are subject to their personal decisions. While in the communal structure of the traditional kibbutz, a wide spectrum of human life was subject to the decision of the General Assembly and committees. Management is essentially hierarchy, entailing a distinctive allocation of power and authority to officials. Exercising managerial power in the kibbutz, even if basically agreed, runs counter to egalitarian intention and to the membership equality. This situation arouses an ambivalent attitude toward managers and challenges their management capabilities. In view of the reservation about management, the traditional kibbutz managed to limit managerial power. It was achieved by flattering the managerial structure, narrowing the authorities of each position, limiting the powers of manager to the definition of each specific function, including public representatives in management teams, keeping the democratic appointment of manager and limiting their term of office. A notable problem in the kibbutz flat organizational structure is the integration between the community and the business sector. This led to a divided organizational structure coordinated by the General Assembly, a role that Assembly can hardly perform because of the breadth of its role the number of participants, its non-professional nature, and its changing structure. Management patterns in the traditional kibbutz developed with reservation concerning formal management should arrange its affairs without manager and managed. Initially, decisions were made at sporadic meetings without a fixed agenda and formal procedures. Soon, however, these meetings were patterned into a general assembly where members discussed and decided on all affairs of the kibbutz in a sort of direct democracy. The all-inclusiveness of the assembly fitted small homogeneous group marked by solidarity and similar worldview, while the issues debated were relatively simple and familiar to the participants. As the kibbutz grew larger and diversified, function in the economic and social system branched out, and it became necessary to define rules of behavior. A mixed agriculture sector developed, and in approach of local autarky, services to the farm sector broadened and did the communal household and education service for children. The work array became arranged into branches, and relative permanence and professionalization developed into workplaces. A member of a branch becomes a branch coordinator of activity. Coordination between the branches in setting objective and allocation resources passed to a farm coordinator. The work roster coordinator allocated worker to the branch and changing the tasks. Handling finance was institutionalized, and the role of treasurer was born. To coordinate organizational functioning and to liaise with the kibbutz movement and other external factors, the role of kibbutz secretary, a sort of community leader, came into being. With the diversification of social and economic structure, the administrative role of the General Assembly diminished. Position holders began to determine the agenda and convening frequency of the Assembly and submit for its approval a proposal that have been already processed by the Secretariat or the Economic Committee. With the decline of the administrative role of the Assembly, with attendance dropping, designated committee and defined area were activated. Alongside the Secretariat, Economic Committee, and the Work Affairs Committee, an array of committees for consumption matters, housing, children education, health, member-specific need, absorption of newcomer, cultural and recreational, etc., were launched. The transition from that democracy, governing via the General Assembly and few central position holders, to a democracy of committees, governing via a system of specific committees, decentralized management and enhanced its democratic quality. The numerous committees allowed many members to take part in managing, including members who had been less active in the General Assembly and were not considered suitable for election to the Secretariat or the Economic Committee. The committees brought management closer to the members, providing accessible arenas for negotiation over some sort of personal needs. Now we turn to the renewed kibbutz. Following the monetary collapse of many kibbutzim in the late 1980s, trends already ingrained in the traditional kibbutz were accelerated and appeared in the renewed kibbutz, of which about 85% of kibbutzim are now part. Prompted by the need to improve the economic infrastructure of the kibbutzim and reinforce its member economic security, demands were voiced to greater personal freedom and responsibility vis-à-vis the collective system. Gradually, a compromise unfolded with the principle of equality and cooperation into essential innovation. First, in transferring the members much of their income from work in the form of differential wages, together with making them responsible for most of their living expenses. And second, in attributing apartment and, in many kibbutzim, certain kibbutz assets to members' ownership. Influenced by external consultant for organizational change, the semantic of position and managerial bodies began changing. Work became source of income, and the workplace a position. The personal budget became a salary. A branch was now a business, and the branch coordinator turned into branch manager. The work coordinator to human resources manager. The treasurer was an upgrade to director of finance. The farm coordinator became business manager. The industry committee was now the board of directors. Kibbutz secretary became community manager or chairman of the kibbutz board of directors. The new term, carrying symbolic meanings, helped to familiarize organizational changes and enhance the management hierarchy structure and the empowering of manager. Formally, the General Assembly is still at the peak of decision-making, but its actual and symbolic status is shrinking. To cope with the declining attendance at the Assembly meeting and preserve a sort of participatory democracy, many kibbutzim apply voting by ballot that preserve members' involvement in decision-making. Emphasizing economic efficiency and managerial expertise, kibbutzim turn less to their own members for filling managerial position, preferring to bring in external experts. Open bids by the Human Resources Unit replace the appointment committee, which had formally identified candidates among kibbutz members only. The turn to external manager was fed by distrust in the local executive, who many of them were held responsible for the economic failures. It was believed that external manager would bring new approaches to advance the stuck systems. In some kibbutzim, this move also was justified by the scarcity of members capable of filling pivotal roles in such a small community like the kibbutz. Another aspect of relying on recruiting external management force was the reliance on external consultants, attorneys, experts for organization changes, for business management and accounting, and so on. Organizational and management dilemmas were inherent to the kibbutz since its beginning as an intentional community. Most of this also caught up in the functioning of the renewed kibbutz, keeping the survival of the traditional organizational culture and demonstrating an ingrained wish to preserve the kibbutz as much as possible in the face of privatization trends. Three factors, all challenged by the privatization trends, combine in affecting the communality of the renewed kibbutz. The quality of its collective life, the degree of the mutual responsibility, and the level of participatory democracy. Ensuring those factors may be seen as a crucial dilemmas facing the renewed kibbutz. Striving for community was always a fundamental code in the kibbutz DNA. Despite elements, contractual relationship that penetrated the social structure, a kind of genuine fraternity have remained a desired goal and object of concern. Decommunalizing consumption and privatizing responsibility for livelihood and the workplace has decreased the scope of management intervention in members' life. Concurrently, so the emphasis of organizational efficiency has strengthened the hierarchy at the level of power that management exercises in the restricted community affairs and more so in the business sector. Concerning the community branches, the community manager strictly supervises a small number of services, including education, health, welfare, nursing, cultural activity, gardening, and buildings maintenance, which are operated by secondary manager reporting to him. As the separation of the shared business from the control of the community has deepened, the integrating of the two is critical. Members' impact on the management of the business is minimized. Concentrated in their private affairs, many members are contented by influencing decisions about social issues and the allocation of monetary resources. The mix of privatization and mutual responsibility among people who have not yet renounced tradition of equality and participatory democracy make it harder to balance diverse orientation and interest. Mostly, those concerned with the allocation of money derived from the common economy and from the members' private income. Tension concerning allocation of resources between private and public were always present in the traditional kibbutz, but were moderated by the strong ideological commitment and social solidarity. In the renewed kibbutz, economic aspects of the system have taken center stage regarding both collective and private interest, bringing organizational functioning to focus on the material aspect of the issue discussed. The economy manager responsible for the profitability of the business and concerned with their own professional success prefer to plow back profit into the business, while the community managers are more concerned with social development and members' well-being. Younger members are also more prompt to support long-term investment in the business than the veteran members whose prospects for enjoying the fruit are shorter.
5 minutes.
Okay. The allowance may be made age-based disagreement or conflict over the business allowances not to the community. These allowances may be made, one, in subsidizing the cost of education, health, culture, and other common services, or two, in direct allocation to the members, usually weighted by seniority. Younger members, parents of children, prefer increasing subsidies, mainly of the costly education, while older members are most interested in direct grants. And problem with tax auditing, something very new to the kibbutz. Being responsible for their livelihood, members are entitled to choose to work whether they please. Most members work on the kibbutz in the services branches or in the business sector or as salaried employees outside the kibbutz. The income for internal taxation purpose and tax reconciliation with the state authorities is audited by the bookkeeping of the kibbutz. More problematic is the tax reconciliation for members running their own business ventures in the kibbutz, and more so for members who run business companies outside the kibbutz. And the tension between participatory democracy and effective governance. Always present in the kibbutz, but intensified in the renewed kibbutz, is another threat to communality. Adding to it is the emphasis on economic effectiveness by sharpening business community separation and the changing General Assembly from an arbitrary form to the approval of decisions cooked by the management. While voting by ballot tones down the interest-based nature of voting in the Assembly with a sparse presence at meeting, the abandoning of debates to clarify the issue at hand reduced the togetherness in decision-making. Linked to the issue of participatory democracy is the integration of the business and community. Two patterns of separation between the two are observable. One, an almost full separation in a dual organizational structure, and two, separation in a combined structure supervised by the kibbutz board of directors. The combined structure features two solutions regarding the top managerial rank. The chairperson of the kibbutz board of directors, a kibbutz member, first among equal in the board, as compared to the chairperson of the kibbutz, usually not a kibbutz member and therefore without the right to vote in the kibbutz board of directors, serving as a sort of president or chief of staff.
2 minutes.
I need one. In the initial
Okay.
the renewed kibbutz, in a threatening economic situation, there was a strong desire to bring in a super manager with proven managerial success, financial know-how and legal understanding, uninvolved in personal disputes and conflicting internal interest. The pioneering kibbutz speculated about functioning without manager. The institutional kibbutz adhered to self-management, applying to the wisdom of the community in treating its problems. The renewed kibbutz and the complexity of changes requires managers. In order to run itself during different times, it preferred external managers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shlomo. And we already have a question or a comment. The floor is open, and Yuval, you start, and then Menachem, you are second. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Shlomo, do you have a transcript of what you just said? Because I had trouble understanding your very Israeli accent.
Yes.
And also my hearing is not very good. Is it written somewhere, or will it be, or do you have some article? I really want to understand what you are saying, and reading it would help me.
Okay. As I told you, the paper itself appeared in a book called The Metamorphosis of the Kibbutz. I can show it here. Published in 1921, I think. And you can read the full paper, which is much more detailed, in this book, The Metamorphosis of the Kibbutz, edited by Eliezer Ben Raphael and Orna Shemer.
Yes, go ahead. But you're muted.
I think that it's important to know that most of the external directors are members of other kibbutzim. Also kibbutz members, but in other kibbutz.
Yes, what Manolo said, that external managers are usually kibbutz members, but not from the same kibbutz. It came from another kibbutz, most of them. Not all of them, but most of them.
Can I ask a question? Oh, yes. Okay. So when you say external managers are from other kibbutz, so why drawing on or going to other, is it to share experience of managerial and other issues or other areas, skills?
Well, what is happening is, first, the kibbutz didn't trust anymore his own members because of kind of crisis that were about 30, 40 years ago. And second, it is said that kibbutz usually have about between 200 to 500, 600 members. So to find managers to all the position in such a small community is sometimes difficult. Another thing is that if you are a member, you have your personal conflicts with other members and so on. So maybe someone from outside is more neutral. And that's why kibbutzim started to hire managers. And now we have many professional managers that are moving from kibbutz to kibbutz. Every 5 years, they are finishing their job in one kibbutz and going to another kibbutz, and that come really a job, a career.
Thank you. Yes, and we have a question from Michal and then Cheryl.
Well, I think what happened is that you asked what I wanted to ask, but I want to add to it something. I think one of the things that identify the kibbutz is the close relationship between people. So now if I am the manager and I am in conflict with my neighbor because of the work he's doing for me, this is a problem. I cannot continue living there, and it becomes a very bad problem. Also, so somebody who comes from outside, okay, So I quarreled with him, he doesn't like me or she doesn't like me, it doesn't matter. But if it is for example, the kindergarten teacher of my child, it is a problem. Or if it is somebody whom I need for my family needs for any other reason, becomes a problem. And once a manager goes outside, he is clear of all those internal conflicts. Shlomo, sorry for taking some of your answers.
Thank you, Michal.
No, we're working together, so it's okay. And we're working on conflicts together, not only that. Okay, sorry. Okay, that's all what I wanted to say now.
Thank you. Yes, Cheryl?
So actually, my question kind of was partly answered by Michal's comments there about whether having the managers be more objective as outsiders reduces conflicts. But the flip side of it is, do members of the community feel that these outsiders have less of a stake in their community and therefore don't really understand their concerns as much?
Yes, that's exactly the problem. And that's why now, after about 20 or 30 years of experience, many kibbutzim try to find their own manager, because he knows the DNA, he knows the members, he knows all kind of things that someone that come for 2 or 3 years to be a manager cannot know. So the tendency now is to have again some local member to do the job. But it's not so easy. Not everyone wants to do that, because it's, as Michal said, it's very, very difficult.
Can I give a quick follow-up on that? So if they then have a long-term member, do they then get back into the problem of they've been involved with the community as the manager for so long that you then develop the interpersonal relations or problems again?
Well, yes and no. It depends on the, let's say, on the personality of the office holder, and how he can manage. And when a kibbutz member finish his term, especially in the secretary of the kibbutz, for many years you don't see him anymore. He doesn't interpret everything, and after a few years he's coming back to be active in the commune.
Thank you.
Can I add a remark on that? I think,
yes, please,
I'm sorry. I think one of the things that happened is also the changed values in the kibbutz. And in the past, the kibbutz people wanted only self-labor, not to take paid labor. So people had to work within the kibbutz. But once the values have been more relaxed, people might sometimes choose other jobs that in the past they were really they avoided them. The kibbutz didn't like them because the kibbutz needed the people only to work in the kibbutz in order to have self-labor. Once the self-labor went away, so many people decided to look into areas that were not in the kibbutz, working areas that are not in the kibbutz. And that's what Shlomo said, that there are many people who work outside because suddenly they found different type of careers that they loved doing, and they didn't want to manage the small things available within the kibbutz, the small jobs available in the kibbutz.
Yes, Cheryl. Yes. You're muted. You're muted, Sharon.
Sorry. 2 things related to that. Do you find that people going out into the community to take jobs has created problems because they're exposed to different things and different ways of doing things? And the flip side of it is, are kibbutz experiencing as their communities aging, are they able to bring in new people, or do they have to bring in outside labor? And does that also cause conflicts?
Wow, that's another presentation. But let's say that now that kibbutz members may choose their job or where to work, and they are not forced to work only on the kibbutz, that make them more attractive to live in the kibbutz. They choose to live in the kibbutz, although their work is in the nearest city. So so it make the, let's say, the choice to live in the kibbutz more real. On the other hand, we have in the kibbutzim many hired workers to take their place in the kibbutz jobs. But it seems that now, the kibbutz is attractive for many young people, the renewed kibbutz, because you can choose your job whenever you want. You are not forced to work in the kibbutz, and you are living in a community that is a close community. So young people, the younger generation of the kibbutz and outside the kibbutz find it very attractive to live in a kibbutz now, in the renewed kibbutz. So there's a big demand to be absorbed on the kibbutz.
Okay.
The kibbutz is flourishing now.
Good.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Now we have come to the end of this session. Thank you very much for very interesting presentations and also active participation by the audience member. I encourage you to get in touch with each other and continue the conversation through either emails or other mediums. But this session is now concluded. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.